We've been hanging around in the markets ever since I called the bottom in the first quarter of 2022, and the bottom hit in October 2022. And you have to wonder if Lillian Boyer ever gets sick of hanging around and watching the markets. So that's why I have this thumbnail on almost all of my videos for quite a long time now. And if you haven't noticed yet, everything I do about analysis and my buys and sells are based on market timing. And the consensus out there is you can't do that. And to be successful market timer, you have to have a great degree of pragmatism. And here's the meaning of pragmatism right out of Oxford: the approach that assesses the truth of the meaning of theories or beliefs in terms of the success of their practical application. And sometimes you have to use your gut instinct and physical signals, like when my corns swell up, that tells me something. And then there's the mental aspect too, which you really can't show, but you need to have and know about yourself. And that's a great degree of perseverance through thick and thin and ups and downs, and never give up, and using all your life experiences to bring it forward to your analysis and decisions. And most of that is why I admire those early 20s wing walkers, and that's 1920s, as they were very daring and confident of themselves and knew their limitations and strengths. And most of them were females, and all of them deserve the gold medal award for having the gift of the gilded gonad. And they had gonads the size of bowling balls. And part of pragmatism is understanding that past could be prologue, and the experiences that you've gone through could manifest themselves again in the present day. So let's look back to the top at the beginning of 2022, where the rising wedge played an important part of calling that, and the rising wedge that's forming now and the similarities to it. So we're going to look at the top in 2022 first. So here is the top, and you can see the run-up from October going into the end of the year, melt up here, and on November 4th, the combo sell countdown 13 printed. And then the next day it ticked higher and formed a doji. Then there was a downdraft here, and then another little melt up here, and this is where we formed the rising wedge. So when I drew it here at these two white candles, I used the bottom of the candles here, the candle wicks, subsequently moved it up. But then you can see it just dropped out of there, and I thought, that's it, we're going into the crash now. And it hit the lower leg of the descending broadening wedge in blue here, somewhat stabilized, and then took off like a banshee. Look at that gap up. I couldn't believe it when I was seeing it, and then it hit a brick wall here at that wedge, and that's when I moved the lower part of the rising wedge to here. Step 2, you can see it printed the sequential sell 13 here when it hit the brick wall at the bottom of that wedge, and it had trouble getting in, and then it had another downdraft here, and then it nailed the top of the descending broadening wedge here, the blue line, and it nailed the lower Stark band at that time, and then just took off like I couldn't believe. I was just awestruck and jaw-dropped that this ran up like that 4 bars in a row back into the wedge. And then the price up here, when I jumped back into the wedge, nailed the top of the upper Stark band. And then the next day it hit the top of the rising wedge, and then it paused for a couple of days and then hit the bottom of the rising wedge and bounced again and made the new all-time intraday high, and the D wave down C and up 5 printed here when it hit the top of the wedge here on January 4th. That candle on that day printed a indecision spinning top candle, that red bodied one right there. So our thinking was, well, if it blasts out of there to the upside, we're buyers, and then if it blasts out of there to the downside, we're shorters. And then the next day, as soon as it came out of the rising wedge, we had a short on, and we massively shorted the S&P 500, step 7 over here, and had a pretty big downdraft all the way into the cloud. And then it bounced out of there and gave us a scare when this combo sell risk level from this combo sell 13 was hit over here and got qualified and confirmed, and that really created some nervousness, and the rest was history the next day. So when it hit there, I was watching intently. As long as it didn't come back up to here, this level where it came out of that rising wedge, I was going to take it all the way back to the top and then let it go. And zoomed out a little, you can see it had a really big downdraft and then a bounce up, and then another really big downdraft and then a bounce up. And then when it got to here and started heading down quite drastically, that's when I said it's going to hit that massive gap zone from the October 2020 run-up. I mean, my corns were swelling up and everything told me that way up here in April. And here's the NYA top caller price chart here. And you can see that right down here, it nailed the bottom of that October 2020 gap up start from that incredible run up back then in 2020. And it just absolutely nailed the bottom of it. I was not at the trade station here, and I was out, and all of a sudden my phone went off like a cash register for like 5 minutes straight. All the buys that I had happened on that day. I think it was the 13th, and I couldn't believe it. I felt really nervous because I wasn't at the workstation, but when I got home I was pleasantly surprised and have been ever since. And we've done some buying along the way. You can see the head and shoulders pattern here and these big W's. When they break out of these big W's that we discovered, did some buying there, and then recently did some selling up here during the formation of this big M. But it wasn't that much selling, just lightening up a little from some of these really old longs. And then back to the current rising wedge. The similarities in the technicals are the same, but definitely different eras for the economy. I mean, back here, the threat of the hiking and roll-off or quantitative tightening was a real threat. So everybody knew the pullback was coming, and still the momentum was just so strong on the Momo crowd that it just kept driving it up, and the rest is history. So if history repeats itself, I'm looking for price to jump back up into this wedge, maybe on another big huge run like over here to get back up into the wedge right before the bottom fell out. And let's see what happens if it gets in there. I have the arrow pointed to the DeMark relative retracement magnet level for the weekly chart, which is, I believe, the all-time closing high somewhere up there, 46.77 or something.